The journey to Tyburn. There was not a sound to be heard in the large courtroom, as the judge slowly reached for the triangle of black cloth and placed it solemnly upon his head. Martindale closed his eyes. He didn't need to hear what the judge was going to say next, for he already knew. His legs started to tremble, and he felt he would collapse as the ominous voice resounded around the oak-panelled walls. "James Martindale, you have been convicted of the theft of £10, a crime punishable by death, and therefore it is my duty to tell you that you will be taken on the morrow to a place of lawful execution, where you will be hung by the neck until you are dead. May God have mercy upon your soul." Martindale opened his eyes. He hadn't been sleeping, just lying in his thinking cell, waiting for the sound of boots coming down the stone-flagged corridor and the jangling of keys. He heard them now as he lay hunched on the wooden bench, shaking like a leaf, his body breaking out in a cold sweat. The cell door opened a moment later, and 2 guards walked in with shackles. He was hauled to his feet, and his wrists were clamped in freezing irons that dug into his skin. They dragged him down the corridor, up the steps, and through the building to the condemned room at Newgate Prison. The clergyman was waiting for him. Martindale listened to him quietly as the shackles were taken off and his hands tied together now by a rope. Henry Bull, the clergyman, had come to his cell the night before to do his sermon. Martindale had barely heard him during that hour. He had been focused on the black coffin by Bull's feet, the one he apparently always brought with him on these occasions. After he had left, Martindale had broken down in tears. He was now momentarily composed, but his heart was pounding, his mouth was dry, and he could barely swallow. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me down to lie in pastures green. He leadeth me the quiet waters by." Martindale suddenly threw up. The vomit landed on the floor by the clergyman's feet and splashed up onto the bottom of those beautiful robes. He didn't stop for a moment, merely stepped back as he continued to read. "My soul he doth restore again, and me to walk doth make within the paths of righteousness, e'en for his own name's sake." The guards now began to escort Martindale to the door. "Yea, though I walk in death's dark vale, yet will I fear no ill, for thou art with me, and thy rod and staff me comfort still." As James Martindale walked through the gates of Newgate, a biting wind was blowing on his face. It was the middle of winter. He took one long, deep breath of the icy air before stepping up into the horse-drawn cart next to the sheriff. So this was it, he thought. The long journey to Tyburn was about to begin. A huge crowd had gathered to witness it, as though he were some kind of royal figure. And in that moment he almost felt special. They were all there to see him. Suddenly everybody wanted to know about the man from Whitechapel, the man who swept streets for a living, the man who drank in the same tavern every night for 10 years. Back then nobody knew who he was or even cared. He was a nobody. And now the only reason people were interested in him was because he was about to die. Over the sound of the crowd he could hear the morning bells of the nearby St. Sepulchre's Church. Tyburn. That name alone chilled the blood in the most hardened of criminals. And he was no hardened criminal. Tyburn was a massive 3-cornered gallows which could accommodate over 20 bodies at a time. He had first heard about Tyburn as a child, when his father had attended an execution there. He had refused to take the impressionable 6-year-old with him, but when he had returned, James had begged his father to describe what had happened. He spoke of watching 5 men slowly choked to death as they dangled from thick ropes. Some members of their family had tried pulling on their legs to quicken their passing. It was a sight that had actually made him feel sick, especially as one of the family members had been a 9-year-old boy. As the cart started off, a huge cheer erupted from the crowd. Music started playing somewhere. He looked up towards the higher windows of the building and saw women waving and blowing kisses to him. He actually raised his hands now and gave them a small wave back. It was only 2 miles to Tyburn, but he had heard it could take up to 3 hours to get through the crowd. The city marshal, a man named Hector Cowell, was present. He had made sure that around the cart were armed guards on horseback. There had been trouble with the crowds in the past, where some people had tried to rescue the condemned man, and ugly scenes had broken out. Cowell was tense now as he kept an eye on things from his own horse. People were pushing and shoving, trying to get a better glimpse at Mortondale. Cowell did not like these events. There were thousands of people who turned out to see these hangings, and there were never enough armed guards to control that kind of a mob. He was of the opinion that execution should be carried out within the walls of Newgate itself and not in the public eye. Although he understood it was meant to act as a deterrent to others who might think of committing crime, it was not good in terms of public disorder. He could still remember when one prisoner had somehow escaped his bonds and darted off through the crowd. As the guards went after him, the crowd intervened and tried to help him escape. They threw stones at the guards and at the executioner and at Cowell when he rode into the crowd. He had been hit on the head and fallen from his horse. It was a miracle he was not crushed by the surging mob. The incident had been widely reported in broadsides throughout London, although some of the reports were either completely wrong or just highly exaggerated, which was quite often the case. Mortondale looked at the sheriff beside him, a man named David Jessup. He was staring straight ahead, his body rigid, his pose professional. Mortondale looked away. He looked at the guards with their long pikes. And it was now, on this journey at the end of his life, that he thought about that life and what it had mean. He wanted to remember the good times, not the bad ones, but inevitably those bad times were there too in his memory. His father was a tanner and ran his own business. For as long as Mortondale could remember, he had wandered around the tanning yard, looking at all the different colours in the large barrels. His father had often warned him, as a very young boy, to stay away from the colour barrels and the pits full of tannic acid. By the time he was 7, he could almost have done the job himself, so familiar was he with the procedure. He had no schooling. Instead, he spent his days sweeping and tidying around the yard and helping his father with errands that needed doing. School was for the children of rich families, and they were not rich. They were better off than some, as his father had told him. When he was 15, he had left home and found himself doing the only thing he knew how to do, sweep the streets. Whitechapel was a disgusting place to exist in. Prostitutes hung out around every corner. Drunks peed and vomited in the gutters, where dead rats and blood were a common sight. It was his job to remove it all. He saw many things in that neighbourhood that he would never forget. Children begging in the streets, constant fights, men beating up their wives, doss houses spilling over with the unfortunates of society. At the end of each day he would head for the Mayor's Hoof, a dingy tavern in the heart of Whitechapel. There he simply blended in to the crowd of patrons. For 10 years he went through the same routine. That was his life. He spoke to nobody, and nobody spoke to him. Now here he was, on the back of a cart, being guarded by men with pikes, and thousands of people were looking right at him. It was a carnival atmosphere. He passed stalls that had been set up purely for this procession. There were people shouting out, trying to sell their broadsides, which would have his name stamped all over it. Jessup suddenly turned his head towards him slightly and asked, over the din, "Do you have your gallows speech?" Mortondale shook his head. "I didn't write one." "Why not?" "This is your chance to go down in history." His tone was sarcastic. "What do they expect me to say?" asked Mortondale. "Perhaps that you are remorseful of your crime and that hopefully God will pardon your soul, that sort of thing." Mortondale said nothing. The sheriff continued to look at him. "Are you remorseful?" he asked. "I didn't do it," replied Mortondale with passion. "But the odds were not in my favour. How can I be remorseful for something I didn't do?" Jessup looked at his feet for a moment. There's nothing I can do now. I just have to accept that. Accept the injustice of it. What I can't accept, what I will never accept, is losing the one person who ever took the time to get to know me. And that is what hurts more than anything else. Who was she? Asked Jessup. Mortondale smiled momentarily. A woman who shouldn't have naturally have been with me. She was from a rich family. Now she has nowhere to turn. The people she was with will not take her back. She didn't care about my status. She just wanted to know me. He looked at Jessup. Me? He shook his head. None of my own class of people wanted to know that. Why did she? Asked Jessup. I saved her life. Jessup nodded slowly. Then I too want to know about you. There is very little to know. And why do you care anyway? You are a hero and a human being. You lived a life, albeit a short life. I like to know about people, especially those whom the state is putting to death. If you're not going to tell the crowd who you are and how you lived, then tell me, here, in this cart. You have 4 hours left to live this life. Share it with me. The cart rattled over the cobbles as the crowd cheered loudly. I grew up in a tanner's yard, quite literally. I kept it clean. I could have been a tanner, but I really couldn't stand the smell in the end. I was 15 when I left home. For the next 10 years I became a ghost, sweeping the streets of Whitechapel. My sympathies, said Jessup. Mortondale laughed. Thank you. I wish I could have swept away more than just the detritus in the gutter. There was the human element as well. Actually, I would hardly call them human. I used to drink at a place called the Mare's Hoof. Every night, usually at the same table. 10 years. Nobody knew me. My father and mother were dead. I had no siblings. I was alone in the world. Until she came along. I was doing a night shift one evening. The lamplighters had already been and gone, but those streets were never quiet. It seemed to me it was a part of a London that never slept. The animals were always out. That's when I saw her, walking along the street. She stood out like a rose in the middle of a thorn bush. I reckon she must have got lost. Suddenly a man stepped out of the shadows and snatched her, dragging her back with him. He put his hand over her mouth so she couldn't scream, and they disappeared down a side alley. I went to her aid immediately. When I found them, he was on top of her, trying to rip her clothes off. She was screaming in terror. I broke my broom across the man's back, and he scampered. Like I said, animals. I helped her to her feet. She was shaking uncontrollably and crying. "Ma'am, let me help you," I said. She fell into my arms, sobbing, and I took her to a nearby inn. I asked her what she was doing in these parts, and she confirmed my first assumption that she had got lost. I sat with her until she had calmed down, then escorted her outside and hailed a cab for her. I thought no more about her, until one afternoon she came back with 3 smartly dressed gentlemen. She pointed me out to them, and they came up towards me, removing their hats. They bowed to me. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," I said a little awkwardly. "Good afternoon to you, sir. We understand that you were of assistance to the lady over there several nights ago." I nodded. "Yes." The man who had spoken removed a pouch of money from his belt and handed it to me. "The lady would like you to have this as a token of her thanks." I took it from him, then looked at the woman who stood on the other side of the street. "Can the lady not thank me in person?" I asked. The man merely not smiled, but he smiled as if I were an innocent child asking a silly question, and then turned away. The 2 others followed after him. They went back to the lady, who had been staring at me the whole time. She suddenly made a move towards me, but the man took her arm to stop her and said something in her ear, at which point she reluctantly went with him. "How much was in the pouch?" asked Jessup. 10 shillings. He nodded. "A nice little sum. Personally, I think you deserved more." That's what she thought too. It was a week later when she returned. How she had the nerve, I will never know, but it seemed she needed to see me. We went back to the same inn, and she paid for a room, so we could talk in private. "I wanted to thank you myself," she said. and to explain a few things. Those men who were with me are my protectors. My fiancé insists that I should go nowhere on my own. He is very protective of me." She was silent a moment. "The other day, when you came to my rescue, I told you a lie. I was not lost. I was trying to elope. As you can see, I come from aristocratic backgrounds. I am engaged to be married to Sir Henry Cook, a member of Parliament. He has some very strong opinions and has made a few enemies. He has therefore placed me literally under armed guard wherever I go, in case I am targeted to get to him. I think he is somewhat paranoid. The other day I had simply had enough and I needed to get away from them. I had been at a dinner and was about to leave in the carriage. As I climbed in, my protectors were distracted by a scuffle that broke out nearby. They went to intervene, and I jumped out of the carriage and stole quickly away. I have never been allowed to explore the city on my own, never been allowed to experience its different moods. I had heard of the Whitechapel district and knew I was not far from there." She lowered her eyes. "It was a foolish thing to do, I know, but I was not thinking." "It was foolish, ma'am, and it was foolish of you to come back. You are only putting yourself in danger coming here. Look what happened last time. I know, but there is something that intrigues me about your class of people. There is so much more to you than there is to people like my fiancé. More vibrancy, more colour. Ma'am, you don't know what you're talking about. There's no colour here, only dark shades of vice. The common class are vulgar and depraved. They care nothing for their fellows. They only care about looking out for themselves. Believe me, I would know." She regarded me for a while. "What are these strong opinions you say your fiancé has?" "He is a strong supporter of public executions, and believes there should be more hanging offences introduced into the penal system. There are over 100 already." She shook her head. "They are disgusting events. I would never go to them. You know parents bring their children to these things? Schools have hanging days where the teachers will take their pupils to see an execution. I have even heard that on some occasions they beat them afterwards to solidify the experience in their minds. It is barbaric. Henry attends every execution there is. He once asked me to come along to one, and I refused. I cannot watch another human being executed, and I cannot see a lady like yourself raped and murdered in a dingy corner of London. So, like before, I will call you a cab, and you will never come back here. Do you understand?" She nodded, but her eyes told me she had other ideas. However, I said no more on the matter. I had literally turned for the door when it burst open, and the lady's 3 protectors strolled in. 2 of them grabbed me and flattened me back against the wall, while the other escorted her from the room. When she was gone, they proceeded to punch me several times around the head and face. "Stay away from her, boy. You understand? If we catch you together again, there will be serious consequences." With that, they left the room, and I passed out. The cart was progressing slowly through the crowd. Jessup cleared his throat. "I know of Sir Henry's opinions. I do not echo them. But I met this fiancée of his once at a dinner. I found her charming, a complete contrast to Sir Henry." "What was her name again?" "Sarah." Jessup nodded. "I am sorry to hear what these men did to you. I have a feeling, though, there is more to this story. Am I right?" Martindale nodded. They were travelling along Holborn, and the crowd seemed a little more unfriendly here. Shouts of abuse were being hurled at Martindale, but that was not all. A rotten apple suddenly hit his left shoulder, and a moment later a brown mass landed on his face. He realized in disgust that it was excrement, but whether human or animal he could not tell. Jessup immediately took a handkerchief from his pocket and removed the stinking mess. He threw it back into the crowd. Martindale looked at him. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." Jessup looked him straight in the eyes, but made no reply. "So did she come back?" "She did, but in disguise. She returned dressed as a common woman, and this time she'd brought something with her." "What was it?" "The money she thought I should have been given for saving her life." "I took this out of his safe box," she said, handing the pouch to me. "Are you insane?" I said. I opened the pouch. It was £10. "What are you doing?" I asked her. "Running away," she said. "I'm not going back to him." "Where are you going to go?" "You mean where are we going to go?" "We?" I repeated. "What are you talking about?" "I owe you my life," she said. "In return, I will be yours." I stared at her. Was she mad? I wondered. Here was I, a poor street cleaner, standing before a woman who came from such a lofty, privileged position, such as I had never known, telling me she would give up all her comfort, just to be with me. You know nothing about me, I replied quietly. Even if we were to get married, we are just too unlike. It wouldn't work. It would also be frowned upon. Then tell me everything about yourself. I sighed. First things first, I said. We need to get the hell out of here. They will be looking for us both. I know a place we can go. It's a cottage on the heath. It's owned by my uncle. We can stay there for the moment. We took a cab as far as the heath and alighted on the edge of it. I knew my way from there, and I didn't want anybody to know exactly where we were. It was getting dark by then, and we picked our way through the trees and over marshy ground until we arrived at my uncle's residence. He was delighted to see me and welcomed us both in. My dear nephew, it has been far too long. Who is this you have brought with you? Uncle, this is Sarah, a friend of mine. We are looking for a place to stay for at least a few nights. I wonder if you could put us up here. Of course we can. You're most welcome. I hope that's okay, Nancy. He turned to his wife, who nodded at once and said we could stay as long as we needed. They put us in with their horse, in a shed built onto the side of the cottage. It was comfortable enough. That night, as we lay listening to the sound of the horse munching gently, she told me the truth about who she really was and where she'd come from. I was not born into the aristocracy. I was born in a doss house in the Whitechapel district. My mother was an unfortunate, very unfortunate as it turned out. I grew up on the street, living from day to day in the filth. Wherever she went, so did I. I was shielded from nothing. We made a living through my mother's profession and mine, pickpocketing. While she worked, I would be picking the pockets of wealthy gentlemen nearby. One day, as I brought my spoils back, we were caught by the Bow Street runners, who had been following me. They arrested us both and took us to a place called Clerkenwell, a holding prison for criminals before they were transferred to Newgate and the Old Bailey for trial. It was the most terrifying place I'd ever been to. The stench was vile, worse than on the street. The jailers were brutal men who delighted in torturing inmates. A lot of people there had done nothing wrong, but others were dangerous and depraved men, like the one who tried to rape my mother. She killed him. A week later she was taken to the Old Bailey and convicted of murder. I would have been convicted of theft and sentenced to the same fate as my mother, had it not been for the gentleman whose money I had stolen that fateful day. In an amazing example of forgiveness and compassion, he adopted me in my ragged state and took me to live with himself and his wife in an upmarket area of London. There I was educated by a governess and transformed from a filthy street urchin into a young woman of grace. But I never forgot my mother, nor where I came from, although I was not permitted to speak of it. My adoptive father introduced me to Henry Cook when I was 17. We got on very well. He was charming and kind, at least to begin with. He began to court me, and I accepted his advances. But as soon as he did, I became his property, and his manner towards me changed, literally overnight. I had to behave in a certain way, dress how he wanted me to dress, etc. I became a prisoner. It was then and only then did I hear about his opinions on capital punishment. I was instantly repulsed by them. Then, one evening, he came back from a night out with my father, during which he had got him very drunk. And in that drunken state my father had told him the truth about my background. "You are the daughter of a whore," he said. "A thieving little vagabond who should have been strung up along with your mother at Tyburn." He grabbed a fistful of hair and put his face in mine so that I could smell the alcohol in his breath. "So what should I do about this? Should I throw you out on the street, tell everybody who you are? Or will I be your saviour, the one you owe everything? I will keep this little secret of yours. In return, you will worship me, bitch. You will treat me like a god who has infinite power, for that is what I wish to have in this life, power and status. I will work my way up through the ranks to Prime Minister. I will hold people's lives in my hand, just like I'm holding yours now. He suddenly slipped his hands around my throat and began to squeeze. I was so scared I couldn't even move. "Is this how it felt for your mother, I wonder? Slowly choking to death?" Or did her neck snap immediately? Tears rolled down my face at his words. He is a sick and twisted man, my fiancé. A man who likes to watch people suffer. Jessup shook his head. "She told you this?" he asked, incredulously. Mortondale nodded. "That bastard. I'd like to see him twisting and writhing on that bloody tree." I cried when I heard her story, and I told her one of my own. I was 16. I had just finished a shift on the street. I took a carriage with my colleague back to his house. He lived on Tyburn Road. When I left him, late in the evening, I was about to hail a carriage when something made me pause. I can't describe what it was that made me want to walk back in the direction of the Tyburn tree. Perhaps a perverse or morbid interest. At any rate, I suddenly found myself standing under it. It was empty. No bodies left over at that time. It was midnight. No one was around. I imagined the ropes swung over the beams, and I imagined all the people who had died here. In that moment I felt a strange sensation. To this day I still can't describe what it was. But it was like I had either been here before, or that I would be here again. A shiver was running up and down my spine. I couldn't stop looking at a certain point on one of the rope beams. It seemed to be dead center. I ran from the spot then and didn't look back. I jumped in a carriage and sat hunched in the back as it trundled back along Tyburn Road, not nearly as fast as I wanted it to be. I wanted to get as far away from that place as quickly as possible, as far away from that unsettling feeling as possible. It was then that we heard the commotion, the splintering of wood, and the sound of a lot of men shouting, and the next second the door to the shed was kicked open and they streamed inside. We were grabbed and yanked to our feet, and there he was, Sir Henry Cook, the man I had heard so much about from Sarah. I was face to face with him. We stared at each other for a moment. "So you're the one who stole my money." "Henry, listen to me," Sarah began saying, but he cut her off. "You," he began, "better get used to living like this again. I will not have you back, and I will make sure everyone knows what you really are." He turned to the runners. "Find the money," he ordered. My belongings were searched, the few that I had. The pouch was found amongst them. "Take this man and throw him in a stinking cell. As for this woman, take her far onto the heath and leave her there." The carriage was approaching the Bowl Inn at St. Giles. "It may seem like an odd question," said Jessup, "but would you like something to eat and drink? Because we can stop here if you want." Mortondale looked at the inn with smoke spiralling from a chimney and then dispersing quickly in the cold wind. He nodded. As the crowds cheered and jeered, Mortondale was helped down from the cart while Cowell, the city marshal, kept a sharp eye on things. "Keep right in," he said to the guards. "Close up those gaps." Suddenly a man made a dash towards them out of the crowd, screaming at the top of his lungs, "Free him!" Mortondale turned to see a guard leap down from his horse and pin the would-be rescuer to the ground. Then 3 other men joined in the attempt. Stones started to be thrown. Jessup dragged Mortondale into the Bowl Inn as the guards closed ranks around them. He could hear Cowell shouting madly. Mortondale was escorted down the cellar stairs where the barrels were kept. There, Jessup led him over to a pair of manacles on the wall and a low stool. "I'm sorry, but I have to do this." He attached Mortondale's wrists to the manacles, but gently. There. A large, stout woman now came into the cellar. She regarded Mortondale for a moment before saying, "What can I get the condemned man?" Mortondale ordered bread and cheese and a large jug of ale. "Right," replied the stout woman, and waddled back up the stairs. They could still hear commotion going on outside as the guards tried to suppress the 4 men who had attempted to rescue the prisoner. Sweat trickled from Cowell's brow. He was breathing heavily. Suddenly a hand grabbed hold of his sleeve from out of the crowd. He wheeled round to see a woman's face, flushed and desperate. "What?" said Cowell irritably. The man you have in custody has been wrongly accused. He did not steal the money. Cal turned away from her. He did not steal it, I'm telling you. Guards, shouted Cal. A guard with a pike advanced on Sarah and shoved her back into the throng of people. No, he's innocent. Aren't they all? Laughed the guard. Sarah pushed her way forward again. Now I'm warning you, wench, shouted the guard. I am no wench. I am the fiancée of Sir Henry Cook. The guard stared at her dirty state. You expect me to believe that? He asked. Well, perhaps not you, but if you let me see the sheriff, I can resolve this matter. If you don't, you're going to be executing an innocent man. Now, I demand that you let me see the sheriff. Oh, you demand, do you, dear? Well, demand denied. Now beat it before I stick you with this. He brandished the pike in her face. Sarah scowled at him, but she retreated back into the crowd. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't rely on another rescue attempt. Her only other chance was to cause a scene at the gallows and beg for his release, hoping the crowd would begin chanting for his freedom. She had heard it happen sometimes. She started pushing her way through the crowd again, making for the Tyburn tree. She knew Henry would be there, sitting in the stand that was always erected for rich people to watch the execution. No doubt he would be enjoying the festivities before the main event. After 15 minutes of pushing and shoving, she reached the stand and scanned it for her ex-fiancé. She saw him immediately, on the second tier. "Henry!" she screamed. He turned his head towards her voice. When he saw her, he just stared for a moment, before saying something to the man he was talking to, at which point they both began laughing. "Henry, I want to talk to you." Henry visibly sighed. He rose and descended the steps towards her. "What do you want?" he asked. "You know what I want." "Oh, that's right. You want me to pardon the condemned man and let him go. You know it was me who stole the money. Why not take my life instead of his?" Henry smiled coldly. "It's more entertaining this way." He laughed. "Look at your face. Such an expression of loathing. Well, that's what I feel towards vermin like your lover. I can't wait to see what your face will look like as you watch him take his last breath." Sarah raised her hand and slapped him hard across his face. He grabbed her wrist and pulled her in towards him. "You get that one for free, you little whore," he said through grated teeth. She tugged free of his grasp, and he turned away. Meanwhile, Mortondale was trying to enjoy his final meal, but he was finding it hard to stomach. Jessup noticed that on several occasions he was gagging, as if he were going to be sick. "Are you all right?" Mortondale looked up at him. "I can't stop thinking about it. It's constantly on my mind." He gagged again. "Take it easy," said Jessup softly. He squatted down next to him. "Look at me." Mortondale looked into the sheriff's eyes. "You'll be okay. I promise. I'll make sure of it. They say you can hang there for up to 45 minutes, choking and vomiting. I'm not going to let that happen. I would instruct the hangman to quicken your passing if that looks like it's going to be the case." Mortondale started to sob. Jessup put a hand on his shoulder. "I did not steal that money. I did not deserve this." Jessup was silent for a moment, as he watched Mortondale cry. He patted his shoulder. "I know," he said at last. "I know." When they re-emerged 10 minutes later, the wind had begun to blow harder and colder, and snow clouds had begun to roll in from the west. Jessup pulled his coat closer about him and screwed up his face as he climbed back up under the cart with Mortondale. As soon as they had emerged, the crowd, who had apparently calmed down, now went back into a frenzy. Cal kept his wits about him, and the cart started off again, on its final leg of the journey to Tyburn. As Mortondale shook and shivered, a single snowflake landed gently on his nose. He saw it fall now all around him, and the westerly wind blew so hard that the snow was almost horizontal. "What a bleak day," said Mortondale suddenly. "A bleak day in a bleak world. Perhaps I am better off somewhere else, a place where angels sing." He looked up into the grey sky above him. "Perhaps they are up there now, waiting to receive me." Snowflakes landed in his eyes and immediately melted in his tears. And it was through those watery eyes that he finally saw the Tyburn tree, appearing like a nightmarish silhouette through the storm. His heart nearly stopped beating. That was where he was going to die. How had it come to this? The car drew over closer. He looked around at the faces in the crowd. His eyes rested on the face of a 12-year-old boy who stared at him curiously. It was a stare he couldn't fathom. Cook sat ramrod straight in his high-collared jacket, seemingly oblivious to the weather. The snow formed layers in his coat and barely melted in his ice-cold face, which looked like it had been chiselled out of the same element. His companion shivered violently, but smiled as a thought came to him. "So, are we placing bets this time?" "We can if you want. Last time his neck snapped. I bet that happens this time." "The neck rarely snaps, unless the condemned is particularly heavy." "Well, I bet it's over quickly." "How much?" £5. "Done," said Cook with a smirk. The smirk remained on his face as he watched the cart draw closer to the gallows. The hangman was an acquaintance. Earlier, in secret, he had paid him a nice little sum and instructed him to make sure the bastard dangled for as long as it took. That meant he was not allowed to pull on the legs or stand on the shoulders to quitting death, nor would anybody be allowed near him to do it themselves. The bad weather was worth braving for this one. When the cart was only a few metres from the gallows, Martindale saw it, dangling menacingly over the beam, the noose that would take his life. A fear came over him at that moment that was far more powerful than anything else he had felt that day. His legs gave way and he crumpled like paper. "Martindale!" shouted Jessup. Then someone else shouted, "String him up!" and the cry was echoed by the bloodthirsty crowd. The closer you got to the gallows, the more eager the mob were for death. At least sometimes. In this instance, at least, it seemed to be the case. Martindale was still on the floor of the cart as it trundled to a halt beneath the noose. He couldn't look up, nor could he stand. The hangman stepped up onto the cart and began hauling him to his feet. "Be gentle with him," demanded Jessup. The hangman frowned, even through his mask. Suddenly Sarah was there. She leapt up onto the side and clung on. "Sarah!" shouted Martindale. He grabbed at her, but the hangman pushed her back and quickly fastened the rope around Martindale's neck. He screamed now in absolute terror. "Oh God, Sarah!" Sarah screamed back at him. "I'm sorry!" Tears streamed down her frozen face. "Forgive me!" The hangman gave a signal to the driver, and the cart was pulled away. Martindale fell, but the noose caught him. He felt the rough rope dig into his neck and instantly tighten. He made a spluttering sound that was drowned out by the roar of the crowd. He struggled to loosen the bonds around his wrists, desperately wanting to free himself. He struggled so hard that they began to bleed as the restraints cut into his skin. The blizzard swirled around him as he dangled by his neck. The harsh wind twisted him hither and thither, making the rope burn even more. His entire body was freezing cold. Snow blew into his face. He couldn't see. He was blinded. Jessup looked at the hangman and gave the signal to pull on his legs, but the hangman merely stood there and watched. Jessup signalled again. Again the man made no move. "Hey!" shouted Jessup. He ran to him. "Do your job, man!" The hangman turned away. Jessup ran towards Martindale and grabbed hold of his legs, but he was knocked to the ground. "Back off, Sheriff! This is my show!" Sarah ran in and helped Jessup to his feet. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" shouted Jessup. The hangman squared his shoulders. He was a large, muscular man, and Jessup had no power over him, or no physical power at any rate. "I am the Sheriff of London, and I demand that you end this man's suffering now." Sarah was crying hysterically. Martindale continued to struggle. The hangman gave another signal, and 2 guards moved in to secure both the sheriff and Sarah. "Get your hands off me!" yelled Jessup. The guard immediately lost his nerve and stepped back. Sarah ripped free of the other guard's grip and ran to the crowd. "Reprieve!" she shouted at the top of her lungs. "Reprieve!" She hoped that the crowd would begin taking up the call, and the hangman would be forced to cut him down. "He is an innocent man! Call for his reprieve! For the love of God, do it!" But the crowd were not sympathetic today, and they continued to pay for his blood. And then something happened. The crowd suddenly went silent. Sarah turned. Mortandale had ceased to struggle. Instead, his body had gone limp as it swayed in the gale. "No!" screamed Sarah. She ran towards him. The hangman didn't stop her this time. She grabbed hold of his legs and then began clawing at him with her numb fingers, as if trying to claw him back from death. Then she collapsed onto the snow, wailing. From his seat, Cook watched the proceedings with a satisfied smile, although he had hoped it would last a little longer. The cart came back, and the hangman cut Mortandale down. He laid him out flat, then removed the rope from around his neck. "I want to go with him," wailed Sarah. "All right," replied Jessup. As the cart pulled away, Sarah looked back to see the hangman cutting up the rope into bits so he could sell it to the crowd. Gallows superstition. "Where are they taking him?" she asked Jessup. "He'll be taken back to Newgate." It took far less time on the journey back. The crowds were dispersing. "Sarah, James told me what happened. I believed him. He was a wronged man. Trials are not fair." He sighed. "What are you going to do now?" "What can I do, Sheriff? I've nowhere to go, nowhere to run for help." When they arrived back at the prison, Mortandale was taken to the mortuary, a cold room down in the basement of Newgate. There he was laid on a bench to await burial. There were no other bodies in the room. "I want to stay with him," said Sarah. Jessup nodded. "I will allow it. But 2 guards will remain on duty outside the door." "He is dead. Where's he going to go?" "It's protocol, Sarah." And with that he left. Sarah sat on a stool next to Mortandale's body. She tried to focus on his face, rather than the rope burns around his neck. "I am so sorry, James. This is all my fault. I should never have come back to Whitechapel. If I hadn't been there, I would not have been attacked, and you would not have had to save me. After that, one thing led to another. I loved you the moment I saw you. My hero. My protector. And yet I could not return the favor. I will never forgive myself." She reached out a hand and touched his stone-cold face. "Sleep tight, my love. My life. My everything." Sarah rose slowly and headed for the door. But she never reached it, because what she heard next stopped her in her tracks. It was a breath. It seemed so loud in the stillness of that little room. She wheeled round and stared at Mortandale's body. No movement. She stepped cautiously forward to take a closer look, but still she could not see. The chest. He was rising. Sarah let out a grasp. The chest fell and rose again. "James!" she shrieked. Mortandale opened his eyes. Sarah flung herself towards him. "James! You're alive!" Mortandale turned his head and looked at her. "Where am I?" he whispered. Mortandale sat still while a surgeon examined him. "How do you feel?" asked the surgeon. "Sore," replied Mortandale in a rasping whisper. "Otherwise fine." "Do you think you could eat something?" asked Jessup. "I could try. Bring him some porridge." When the surgeon had finished examining Mortandale, Jessup took him to one side. "What do you think? Is it a miracle?" "My medical opinion is quite straightforward. When he was hanged yesterday, the weather was atrocious. The temperature was freezing. I think his body went into some kind of self-preservation mode. His organs temporarily shut down to protect themselves, therefore keeping him alive, even though he was hanging. Do I think it's a miracle? No. But I think his maker had other plans for him." Jessup watched the boat sail away down the Thames under cover of darkness, the boat that would take Sarah and Mortandale to a new life. He sighed and smiled. "Well, James, he said out loud. You told me about your life up till this point. Hopefully one day I'll hear the rest of the story.